In the heart of New Orleans, where the vibrant culture of the city collides with deep-seated divisions, 18-year-old Caleb Walker's life takes a harrowing turn. After a brutal and unjust arrest shakes him to his core, Caleb finds himself haunted by unsettling visions of a mysterious woman who bears an uncanny resemblance to his late mother. As a new sheriff takes office, bringing with him a wave of change, Caleb is thrust into a whirlwind of secrets that have been buried for generations. With his best friend Malik by his side and the unexpected support of Sheriff Jackson Reed, Caleb embarks on a perilous journey to uncover the truth about his family's past. But as he delves deeper, he uncovers a shocking revelation that shakes him to his very foundation. Sheriff Reed is not just an ally. He's his father, a man Caleb never knew existed. As powerful forces try to keep the truth buried, Caleb must confront his own demons, reconcile with his newfound father, and find the strength to fight for the justice that has long been denied to his family. Beneath the surface is a gripping tale of identity, family, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a world where the past and present collide in unexpected ways. Caleb Walker wiped the sweat from his brow as he exited the back door of Benny's diner, his shoulders sagging under the weight of exhaustion. It had been another long day of scrubbing dishes and mopping floors, but he was used to it by now. At 18, Caleb knew the grind of hard work all too well. His hands were roughened from hours of labor, and his feet ached with every step, but he didn't mind. What bothered him more was the constant reminder of the life he was trying so hard to escape. As he walked through the narrow streets of the South Side neighborhood, the opulence around him felt almost mocking. Gleaming luxury cars lined the curbs, and well-dressed tourists strolled along, laughing and carefree. Caleb adjusted the brim of his worn-out baseball cap, pulling it lower over his eyes. He knew he didn't belong here. His faded jeans and scuffed sneakers were a stark contrast to the designer clothes and sparkling jewelry on display. He passed by a boutique, its windows glowing with soft, ambient light. Inside, a couple admired a sleek black dress, the woman's laughter ringing out as she held it up against herself. Caleb's eyes lingered for a moment before he quickly looked away, his chest tightening with a familiar mix of envy and frustration. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live a life where his biggest worry was choosing between designer labels. But that wasn't his reality. His was a life of working double shifts to help his grandmother pay the bills, of scraping by just to make it through the month. As he turned the corner onto his own street, the world around him seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, the buildings more worn. His neighborhood was a far cry from the polished streets of Southside. Here, the paint peeled from the walls of aging houses, and the sidewalks were cracked and uneven. But it was home, and it was the only place he felt he truly belonged. He was nearly at his front door when the familiar sound of a police siren cut through the air, sending a jolt of fear down his spine. The police car screeched to a halt beside him, and two officers jumped out, their faces twisted with suspicion. "Hey, boy!" one of them barked, his voice dripping with disdain. "What are you doing around here?" Caleb froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He kept his head down, avoiding the officer's gaze. "I'm just heading home from work, sir," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced. "You look like you've been up to no good," he said, stepping closer. "Empty your pockets." Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pockets, pulling out his phone, a few crumpled bills, and his keys. The second officer snatched the items from his hands, tossing them carelessly onto the ground. "Check his bag," the first officer ordered, nodding towards Caleb's backpack. Caleb slowly slid the bag off his shoulder, handing it over without a word. He knew better than to argue. He'd seen what could happen if he did. As the officer rifled through his belongings, Caleb felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He was just a kid trying to get home, but to these officers, he was already guilty. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. In their eyes, his skin color was enough to warrant suspicion. The search turned up nothing, but that didn't seem to matter. "You're coming with us?" the first officer said, grabbing Caleb's arm and pulling him towards the police car. "Wait, I haven't done anything," Caleb protested, panic rising in his chest. But his words fell on deaf ears. The officer pushed him roughly into the back seat, slamming the door shut behind him. As the car sped off towards the station, Caleb's thoughts raced. What would his grandmother think? How would he explain this to her? The fear of disappointing her weighed heavily on him, but there was nothing he could do now. He was trapped, and all he could do was pray that someone would believe him. The hours dragged on in the cold, dark cell where Caleb sat, his back against the rough concrete wall. He had lost track of time, his thoughts a jumble of fear and anger. But through it all, one thought remained clear. He had to get out of here. It was past midnight when he finally heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The cell door creaked open, and a stern-looking officer stood in the doorway. "Your grandmother's here to get you," he said, his tone laced with indifference. Caleb's heart leaped at the mention of his grandmother. He scrambled to his feet, his body aching from the hours spent on the cold floor. As he was led out of the cell, he saw her standing in the hallway, her small frame dwarfed by the towering officers around her. Hazel Walker was a force to be reckoned with, despite her age. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her warm brown eyes, usually filled with kindness, now blazed with a fierce determination. "Where is my grandson?" she demanded, her voice steady and unwavering. "You have no right to treat him like this." One of the officers tried to placate her, but she wasn't having it. "He's just a boy coming home from work," she continued, her voice rising. "You can't just take him away like that." The officer hesitated, clearly taken aback by her assertiveness. After a tense moment, he relented. "We didn't find anything on him. He's free to go." Caleb rushed to his grandmother's side, relief washing over him as she pulled him into a tight embrace. "Let's go home, baby," she whispered, her voice softening as she held him close. The walk home was silent, save for the occasional sigh from Hazel. Caleb could feel the weight of her worry pressing down on him, but he didn't know what to say. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the same fear that he had felt in that cell. It was a fear that had no place in their lives, but had become all too familiar. As they reached their front door, Hazel finally spoke. "You need to be strong, Caleb," she said, her voice firm. "This world is unjust, but you can't let it break you." Caleb nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'll try, Grandma," he replied, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. That night, Caleb lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, each moment a sharp reminder of how little control he had over his own life. He could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists, the stares of the officers as they treated him like a criminal. His eyes grew heavy as exhaustion finally began to take hold, pulling him into a restless sleep. But peace was fleeting. In his dreams, he found himself standing in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Ahead of him stood a woman, her back turned to him. There was something achingly familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. He called out to her, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she began to walk away, her figure slowly fading into the darkness. Desperation surged through him. He tried to follow, his feet moving as if through quicksand. The harder he tried to reach her, the further away she seemed. Just as she was about to disappear completely, she turned her head slightly, giving him a glimpse of her face. It was his mother. Caleb jolted awake, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark and still, but the image of his mother lingered in his mind, vivid and haunting. He hadn't seen her face in years, not since the day she died. But now, here she was, alive in his dreams. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the dream than just his imagination. It felt too real, too connected to everything that had happened that day. What was she trying to tell him? What did it mean? As he lay back down, trying to calm his racing heart, one thing became clear. He couldn't ignore this. There was something buried in his past, something that his mother wanted him to find. And whatever it was up to him to uncover it. The weight of the day's events settled heavily on his chest, but with it came a new sense of purpose. He had to be strong, just like his grandmother said, strong enough to face whatever lay ahead, no matter how terrifying it might be. And with that thought, he drifted back to sleep, the image of his mother still etched in his mind, guiding him towards the truth. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Caleb's room, pulling him from a restless sleep. The dream still clung to him, vivid and unsettling, as he forced himself out of bed. He knew he couldn't ignore it, but he had no idea where to begin searching for answers. For now, he had to focus on getting through the day. As Caleb entered the kitchen, he found his grandmother, Hazel, sitting at the small wooden table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her eyes, still heavy with the worry of the night before, lifted to meet his. "How did you sleep, baby?" she asked, her voice soft and full of concern. Caleb hesitated, not wanting to burden her with his troubled dreams. "I'm all right, Grandma," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Hazel nodded, clearly not convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she handed him a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. "You need to eat something. You've got a long day ahead." As they ate in silence, the television in the living room hummed in the background, the morning news anchoring them to the present. The newscaster's voice broke through the quiet, catching Caleb's attention. In local news, newly appointed Sheriff Jackson Reed held a press conference this morning, announcing an internal investigation into alleged misconduct within the New Orleans Police Department. Sheriff Reed, who took office just last week, is known for his tough stance on corruption and has vowed to bring justice to those who have been wronged. Caleb's head snapped up at the mention of the sheriff's name. Hazel, too, looked toward the TV, her brow furrowing. "Maybe this new sheriff will do some good," Hazel said, her tone hopeful yet cautious. "Lord knows this city could use some change." Caleb nodded, though he wasn't sure what to think. The memory of his arrest was still too fresh, the wound too raw. But a part of him couldn't help but wonder if this Sheriff Reed could be different. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that things could change. Later that day, Caleb found himself walking the familiar route to Malik's house. The streets were bustling with life, but Caleb felt a strange sense of unease as he walked. His mind kept drifting back to the dream and to the new sheriff's investigation. Could there be a connection? Lost in thought, Caleb didn't notice the police car until it was right behind him. The low hum of the engine sent a shiver down his spine. His heart began to race, and instinctively, he quickened his pace, hoping to shake the feeling of being watched. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, though the words did little to ease his growing anxiety. He kept his eyes forward, resisting the urge to look back, but he could feel the car trailing him, its presence like a dark cloud hovering just above him. Finally, he turned down a narrow alley that led to Malik's building, hoping the car would move on. When he reached the entrance, he hesitated for a moment, then dared to glance over his shoulder. The police car was gone. Breathing a sigh of relief, Caleb quickly entered the building and took the stairs two at a time to Malik's apartment. When Malik opened the door, Caleb was met with his friend's usual bright smile. "Hey man, what's up?" Malik greeted, but his smile faded when he saw the look on Caleb's face. "You all right?" Caleb stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I just got followed by a police car," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Malik's expression darkened. "Again? Man, this is getting out of hand. They won't leave you alone." Caleb nodded, rubbing his hands together anxiously. "I don't know what to do, Malik. It's like they're just waiting for me to mess up. And after what happened yesterday," he trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. Malik placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Caleb. We'll figure something out. But you gotta be careful. Don't give them any reason to come after you." "I know," Caleb muttered, though the fear in his chest made it hard to believe his own words. "But it's like no matter what I do, they're always there, waiting." Malik squeezed his shoulder, trying to offer comfort. Maybe this new sheriff will make a difference. If he's really investigating the police, then things could change. Just keep your head down and stay out of trouble until then. All right? Caleb nodded, though the uneasy feeling in his gut remained. The two friends sat in Malik's living room, the TV playing softly in the background. The room was small but cozy, filled with the sounds of the neighborhood drifting through the open window. They had been talking for a while, trying to distract themselves from the ever-present tension that seemed to hang over them. "Have you heard anything about that new sheriff?" Caleb asked, breaking a moment of silence. Malik shrugged. Just what was on the news this morning. I don't know much about him, but from what I've heard, he doesn't tolerate corruption. Maybe he's the real deal. I hope so, Caleb said, leaning back against the worn sofa. Because if things don't change, I don't know how much more of this I can take. Yesterday was bad enough, but today... Malik's eyes softened with understanding. I get it, man. I really do. But you've got to keep your cool. The last thing you want is to give them a reason to mess with you again. Caleb sighed, running a hand over his face. Yeah, you're right. It's just hard, you know? I'm always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next time they'll try to pull something. Malik nodded, his expression serious. We can't let them get to us. That's what they want, to break us down. But we've got to stay strong, for ourselves and for our families. Yeah, Caleb agreed, though his voice was filled with doubt. But what if this doesn't stop? What if this is just how it is? Malik's grip tightened on the armrest of the sofa, his knuckles turning white. Then we keep fighting. We don't give up. We owe it to ourselves to stand up and not let them push us around. The conviction in Malik's voice brought a small spark of hope to Caleb's heart. He had always admired Malik's determination, even when things seemed bleak. If Malik could stay strong, then maybe, just maybe, Caleb could find the strength to do the same. As Caleb made his way home that evening, the sky was beginning to darken, the first stars appearing overhead. He walked slowly, lost in thought, the day's events swirling around in his mind. The police car, the new sheriff, his dream. They all felt connected somehow, but he couldn't quite piece it together. When he arrived home, he found Hazel in the living room, reading an old book with her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She looked up as he entered, offering him a tired smile. Long day? She asked, setting the book aside. Yeah, Caleb replied, sitting down beside her. But there's something I need to talk to you about, Grandma. Hazel's expression grew serious, and she turned to face him fully. What is it, baby? Caleb hesitated, unsure of how to begin. But then he remembered the dream, the woman who looked so much like his mother. I had this dream last night about Mom. Hazel's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of something else there too, something Caleb couldn't quite place. What kind of dream? She was different, like she was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand it. And then today, I heard about the new sheriff investigating the police. I don't know why, but I feel like it's all connected somehow. Hazel's face grew pale, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Caleb, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Hazel took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. Your mother. She wasn't just an ordinary woman. She was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And this new sheriff, Jackson Reed, he knew her. They fought together for justice, but it cost them both dearly. Caleb stared at his grandmother, his mind reeling. What do you mean they fought together? What are you talking about? Hazel's eyes filled with tears, but she held Caleb's gaze, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Your mother was a freedom fighter, Caleb. She fought against the injustices that have plagued our community for generations. And Jackson Reed was with her every step of the way. Caleb felt the room spinning around him, his thoughts racing. Why didn't you tell me this before? Why keep it a secret? Hazel reached out, taking his hand in hers. I was trying to protect you. Your mother's past? It's dangerous, Caleb. But now that Reed is back, you need to know the truth. There's more to your family than you realize, and I fear that the past is about to catch up with us. As the weight of his grandmother's words settled over him, Caleb felt a surge of fear, but also a glimmer of something else, hope. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was beginning to understand the pieces of the puzzle that had been haunting him. I need to talk to Sheriff Reed, Caleb said, his voice firm. I need to know everything. Hazel nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. Be careful, Caleb. This road you're about to walk down, it's full of dangers. But you're strong, just like your mother. And whatever you decide, I'll be right here with you. Caleb looked into his grandmother's eyes, seeing the strength and love that had carried him through so much. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. ready to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The next morning, Caleb was up early, unable to shake the conversation with his grandmother from his mind. Her words had opened a door to a past he never knew existed, and now, more than ever, he felt compelled to uncover the truth. After a quick breakfast, he decided to head to the local library, hoping to find some clues about his mother's past and her connection to Sheriff Reed. The library was quiet, a stark contrast to the noise in Caleb's head. He made his way to the back, where rows of old newspapers and records were kept. Sitting down at a table, he began sifting through the archives, searching for any mention of his mother or Jackson Reed. Hours passed, and just when Caleb was starting to lose hope, he stumbled upon an article from nearly 2 decades ago. The headline read, "Local Activist Leads March Against Police Brutality." Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he saw the photograph accompanying the article. It was his mother, younger but unmistakable, leading a group of protesters down the streets of New Orleans. Standing beside her, with a determined look on his face, was a younger Jackson Reed. Caleb's eyes widened as he read the article, which detailed the march and the subsequent violent crackdown by the police. His mother and Reed had been arrested that day, along with several others, but they had continued to fight against injustice after their release. The article painted them as heroes in the struggle for civil rights, but it was clear that their efforts had come at a high cost. As he continued reading, Caleb felt a mix of pride and sorrow. His mother had been a fighter, a warrior for justice, but why had she kept this from him? And why had Reed stayed silent all these years? The more he learned, the more questions he had. Just as he was about to close the article, a name caught his eye. Sarah Walker. A name mentioned in connection with an incident that took place shortly before Caleb was born. It was a name he didn't recognize, but the mention of Walker made him pause. Was this person related to him somehow? He quickly scribbled down the details and decided he needed answers. It was time to confront the only person who could give them to him, Sheriff Jackson Reed. Caleb returned home with the article in hand, his mind racing with the new information he had uncovered. As he stepped into the house, he found Hazel sitting on the porch, knitting in the warm afternoon sun. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. "Grandma, we need to talk," Caleb said, his voice steady but urgent. Hazel set her knitting aside and gestured for him to sit down beside her. "I figured you'd have more questions," she said, her voice weary. Caleb handed her the article, watching as her eyes scanned the page. "Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" he asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "Why did you keep it a secret?" Hazel sighed, folding the newspaper in her lap. "I did it to protect you, Caleb. Your mother was involved in something dangerous, something that nearly cost her her life more than once. After you were born, she wanted to leave all that behind. She wanted a fresh start, a safe life for you. But why didn't she tell me? Why didn't you tell me?" Caleb pressed, feeling the weight of years of secrecy. "Your mother was afraid, Caleb," Hazel explained, her voice softening. "She knew the risks. She knew that if anyone found out who she really was, you could be in danger. And when she passed, I couldn't bring myself to put that burden on you. I thought it was better that you didn't know." Caleb's anger began to wane as he saw the pain in his grandmother's eyes. He knew she had only been trying to protect him, but it didn't make the truth any easier to accept. "I understand, Grandma," he said quietly, placing a hand on hers. "But I need to know everything now. I need to know who Sarah Walker is. I found her name in the article, and I think she's connected to all of this." Hazel's expression grew even more somber, and she nodded slowly. "Sarah Walker was your mother's sister, your aunt. She was just as involved in the fight as your mother was. But she disappeared shortly before you were born. No one's heard from her since." The revelation hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He had an aunt, a part of his family he never knew existed, and she was out there, somewhere, a part of the same dangerous world his mother had been a part of. "I need to find her," Caleb said, his voice filled with determination. "I need to know what happened to her and why she disappeared." Hazel looked at him with a mixture of fear and pride. "I'm scared for you, Caleb," she admitted, "but I know you have to do this. Just promise me you'll be careful." Caleb nodded, squeezing her hand. "I promise, Grandma. I'll be careful." The following day, Caleb stood outside the police station, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how Sheriff Reed would react to him showing up unannounced, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had too many questions, and Reed was the only one who could give him the answers he needed. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The station was bustling with activity, officers moving quickly from one task to the next. Caleb spotted Reed's office at the end of the hallway and made his way towards it, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, then knocked firmly. A voice from inside called for him to enter, and Caleb pushed the door open, stepping into the office. Sheriff Jackson Reed looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of surprise. "What brings you here?" Caleb closed the door behind him, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to take place. "I found some things out, Sheriff. About my mother and about you." Reed leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What exactly did you find out?" Caleb handed him the article, watching as Reed's eyes scanned the page. The sheriff's face remained impassive, but Caleb could sense the tension in the room. "I need to know the truth," Caleb said, his voice firm. "I need to know about my mother and about Sarah Walker. I found her name in the article, and I know she's my aunt. What happened to her?" Reed set the article down on his desk, his expression finally softening. "You've done your homework," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "I suppose it's time you knew everything." Caleb remained silent, waiting for Reed to continue. "Your mother and I were close," Reed began, his voice steady. "We fought side by side for years, trying to bring justice to this city. Sarah was part of that fight too. She was fierce, just like your mother. But she got in over her head. There were forces at play that even we couldn't control." "What happened to her?" Caleb asked, his throat tightening. Reed sighed, his gaze distant. "She went underground. We lost contact with her just before you were born. We tried to find her, but it was like she disappeared off the face of the earth. We feared the worst, but we never stopped hoping that she'd come back." Caleb felt a surge of grief for the aunt he never knew, but also a burning desire to find her. "Do you think she's still alive?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Caleb," Reed admitted. "But if she is, we'll find her. I promise you that." Caleb nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He was angry, sad, and hopeful all at once. But most of all, he felt a deep sense of purpose. He had to find Sarah, not just for himself, but for his mother, for Hazel, and for the truth. As Caleb left the station, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The weight of everything he had learned pressed down on him, but there was also a sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do next. That evening, he sat with Hazel in their small living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He told her everything that Reed had revealed, watching as her expression shifted from sorrow to resolve. "Grandma, I'm going to find her," Caleb said, his voice steady. "I don't know how, but I'm going to find Sarah." Hazel looked at him, her eyes filled with both pride and fear. "I know you will, Caleb," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But remember, this isn't just about finding Sarah. It's about uncovering the truth about our family, about everything that's been hidden from you. Be careful, and don't let your anger cloud your judgment." Caleb nodded, knowing that she was right. "I'll be careful, Grandma. I promise." As the night wore on, Caleb lay in bed, his thoughts racing. The path ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were real, but he was ready. He had to be. For too long, the truth had been buried, and it was time to bring it to light. The next morning, Caleb set out with renewed determination. He didn't know where the search for his aunt would lead, but he knew that he wouldn't stop until he had the answers he sought. And with every step he took, he felt closer to the truth, closer to understanding who his mother really was, and who he was meant to be. As he walked through the streets of New Orleans, the city that had been both his home and his prison, Caleb felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had ever known. The fight for justice, the fight for his family, it was his fight now, and he wouldn't back down, no matter what the cost. Caleb sat in the quiet of his room, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. The revelation about his Aunt Sarah, the connection between his mother and Sheriff Reed, and the mysterious disappearance of his aunt. It all swirled in his mind, leaving him feeling both overwhelmed and determined. He had to find Sarah, but he also had to process the truth about his family's past and what it meant for his future. Later that day, Caleb decided to talk to Malik. He needed to share what he had discovered with someone who could help him make sense of it all. They met at their usual spot on the roof of Malik's apartment building, where they often escaped the pressures of their daily lives. The view of the city from the rooftop always provided a sense of clarity, and Caleb hoped it would do the same now. "So, what's going on?" Malik asked, leaning against the railing as he looked at Caleb with concern. "You've been pretty quiet since yesterday." Caleb took a deep breath, unsure of how to start. "I found out some things about my mom and my aunt," he began, his voice low. "Stuff I never knew. Sheriff Reed told me a lot of it, and it's pretty heavy." Malik raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What kind of stuff?" Caleb explained everything: the article he found, his mother's involvement in the civil rights movement, the disappearance of his Aunt Sarah, and Reed's connection to all of it. As he spoke, Malik listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. "Man, that's a lot to take in," Malik said when Caleb finished. "I mean, your mom and your aunt were out there fighting for justice, risking everything, and you never knew?" Caleb shook his head, the reality of it still sinking in. "No, I didn't. And now I feel like I owe it to them to figure out what happened to Sarah. She's still out there somewhere, Malik. I can feel it." Malik nodded, his gaze focused on the city below. "I get it, Caleb, but you've got to be careful. If your mom and Sarah were mixed up in something dangerous, then you could be walking into a lot of trouble." "I know," Caleb replied, his voice resolute, "but I have to do this. I have to know the truth." Malik turned to face him, his expression filled with both concern and admiration. "Well, whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. You don't have to go through this alone." Caleb felt a surge of gratitude for his friend. "Thanks, Malik. That means a lot." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden light, Caleb felt a sense of resolve settling within him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. And with Malik by his side, he knew he could handle whatever came his way. The next morning, Caleb found himself standing outside Sheriff Reed's office once again, this time with a clearer sense of purpose. He had spent the night thinking about everything Reed had told him and everything his grandmother had revealed. It was time to take the next step, and for that, he needed Reed's help. When he knocked on the door, Reed's voice called out from inside, "Come in." Caleb entered the office, and Reed looked up from his desk, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Caleb, I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." "I've been thinking about everything you told me," Caleb said, not wasting any time. "About my mom, about Sarah, about all of it. And I've made a decision. I want to find Sarah. I want to know what happened to her, and I want to know why she disappeared." Reed studied Caleb for a moment before nodding slowly. "I had a feeling you'd say that. But you need to understand, Caleb, this isn't going to be easy. There are people out there who don't want the truth to come out. If we start digging, we're going to stir up a lot of trouble." "I know," Caleb replied, his voice steady, "but I have to do this. I need to know the truth, no matter what it takes." Reed leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "All right then. If you're serious about this, I'll help you. But we need to be smart about it. We can't just go charging in without a plan." Caleb nodded, feeling a sense of relief that Reed was on board. "What do we do first?" Reed stood up and walked over to a file cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Caleb. "This is everything we have on Sarah's case. It's not much, but it's a start. We'll need to go through it together, see if there's anything we missed." Caleb took the folder, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was a start, but he knew they had a long way to go. "Thanks, Sheriff," Caleb said, meeting Reed's gaze. "I appreciate this." Reed gave him a small smile. "We're in this together now, Caleb. And call me Jackson. We're past formalities." Caleb couldn't help but smile back. "All right, Jackson. Let's find out what happened to my aunt." Over the next few days, Caleb and Jackson worked closely together, poring over the files and following up on old leads. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that Sarah's disappearance was no accident. There were forces at play that had wanted her silenced, and they had succeeded in erasing her from the public record. One afternoon, Caleb and Jackson met at a small diner on the edge of town, a quiet place where they could talk without being overheard. They sat in a booth near the back, the folder of documents spread out on the table between them. "Look at this," Jackson said, pointing to a photocopied page from an old police report. This was the last known sighting of Sarah. She was seen leaving a meeting with some high-profile activists, but after that, nothing. It's like she vanished into thin air. Caleb studied the report, his mind racing. Do you think she was taken? Or did she go underground on her own? It's hard to say, Jackson replied, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. But there's something about this report that doesn't sit right with me. The officers who filed it, they were known for being involved in some shady dealings back in the day. If they were involved in Sarah's disappearance, we're going to have a hard time getting the truth out of them. Caleb felt a surge of frustration. So what do we do? How do we get them to talk? Jackson leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing. We apply pressure. We start asking questions, letting them know we're digging into the past. If they have something to hide, they'll make a mistake, and when they do, we'll be ready. Caleb nodded, feeling a sense of determination. All right, let's do it. Jackson gave him a nod of approval. You're handling this well, Caleb. I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing. Caleb appreciated the encouragement, but he knew they were just getting started. The truth was out there, but finding it would require patience and perseverance. A week later, as Caleb was leaving work late one night, he noticed a figure lurking in the shadows near his house. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. The figure stepped out of the shadows, and Caleb recognized him as one of the officers who had arrested him. The man's expression was cold, and his eyes were filled with a menacing glint. What do you want? Caleb demanded, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The officer took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. You and that sheriff need to stop asking questions, kid. You're digging into things that don't concern you, and if you keep it up, you're going to regret it. Caleb felt his anger flare. I'm not backing down. I'm going to find out what happened to my aunt, no matter what you try to do. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. You think you're tough, huh? Let me tell you something, kid. People who dig too deep don't last long in this city. You do well to remember that. Without another word, the officer turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Caleb stood there, his heart racing, the threat hanging heavy in the air. He hurried home, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. When he got inside, he locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. Hazel, who had been sitting in the living room, looked up in alarm. Caleb, what's wrong? Caleb quickly recounted the encounter with the officer, his voice shaking slightly. He said we need to stop asking questions, or we'll regret it. Hazel's face paled, and she stood up, crossing the room to stand by his side. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Caleb. They're trying to scare you, to make you stop. Caleb took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I'm not stopping, Grandma. I can't. I have to see this through. Hazel placed a hand on his cheek, her eyes filled with both love and fear. I know you do, baby. Just promise me you'll be careful. I can't lose you too. Caleb nodded, pulling her into a tight hug. I promise, Grandma. I'll be careful. As they stood there, holding on to each other, Caleb felt a renewed sense of resolve. The threat had shaken him, but it hadn't broken him. He was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, to find his aunt, and to bring those responsible to justice. But he knew the path ahead was dangerous, and that every step would bring new challenges. With Hazel's support and Jackson by his side, Caleb was ready to face whatever came next. The fight for the truth was just beginning, and he wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the window as he stared down at the stack of papers before him. Jackson had provided him with even more documents, old reports, and statements that painted a grim picture of corruption and cover-ups. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Sarah's disappearance was tied to a much larger conspiracy. Hazel entered the kitchen, her eyes filled with concern as she looked at her grandson. "You've been at this all night, Caleb. You need to rest." Caleb shook his head, his determination unwavering. "I'm so close, Grandma. We're finally starting to piece it all together. I can't stop now." Hazel sighed, sitting down beside him. "I know you're determined, but you need to take care of yourself too. This fight, it's not going to be over quickly. You have to pace yourself." Caleb reached out, taking her hand in his. "I know, Grandma, but I've got to keep going. We're about to make our move, and we need to be ready." Hazel nodded, squeezing his hand. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back safe." "I promise," Caleb said, giving her a reassuring smile. "We're going to do this, Grandma. We're going to find out what happened to Sarah, and we're going to get justice." Just then, Caleb's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, seeing a message from Jackson. "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot." Caleb stood, grabbing his jacket. "I've got to go meet Jackson. We're making our final push today." Hazel stood as well, her worry evident. "Be safe, Caleb. And remember, you're not alone in this." Caleb nodded, giving her one last hug before heading out the door. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, but he was ready. The fight for justice was at hand, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Caleb met Jackson at the small diner on the edge of town, the same place they had been meeting for the past few weeks. Jackson was already seated in their usual booth, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as Caleb approached, his expression grim. "Caleb," Jackson greeted him, motioning for him to sit. "We've got a problem." Caleb slid into the booth, his heart skipping a beat. "What's going on?" Jackson handed him a folded piece of paper. "We've got confirmation that some of the officers involved in your aunt's disappearance are still active in the department, and they're not happy that we're digging into the past." Caleb unfolded the paper, reading the names listed there. They were the same names that had appeared in the old reports, the same officers who had been involved in Sarah's last known whereabouts. His anger flared as he looked back at Jackson. "So what do we do?" Caleb asked, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We confront them," Jackson said, his tone equally firm. "We've got enough evidence to bring them in for questioning, but we need to be prepared. They're not going to go down without a fight." Caleb nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. "I'm ready. Let's do this." Jackson finished his coffee and stood up, placing a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Caleb. Your mother would be proud of you." Caleb looked up at him, feeling the weight of his words. "Thanks, Jackson. I'm doing this for her, and for Sarah. We can't let them get away with what they did." Together, they left the diner, heading towards the police station where the officers in question were stationed. As they approached the building, Caleb felt a mix of fear and anticipation. This was it, the moment they had been building towards. He was about to confront the people responsible for tearing his family apart, and he wasn't going to back down. They entered the station, the atmosphere tense as they made their way to the office where the officers were gathered. Jackson pushed open the door, and all eyes turned to them. "What's this about, Reed?" one of the officers demanded, his tone aggressive. Jackson's expression remained calm, but his voice was steely. "We're here to talk about Sarah Walker. We know you were involved in her disappearance, and we've got the evidence to prove it." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. The officers exchanged nervous glances, and Caleb could see the fear in their eyes. They knew the truth was about to come out. "You don't know what you're talking about," one of the officers snapped, trying to maintain control. "You're digging into things that are better left buried." Caleb stepped forward, his voice clear and unwavering. "Sarah was my aunt. I'm not letting this go. You're going to answer for what you did." The officer's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Jackson spoke again. "We're bringing you in for questioning. If you cooperate, things might go easier for you. But if you resist, you'll face the full force of the law." For a moment, it seemed like the officers might fight back, but then one of them, the youngest, took a step forward, his expression resigned. "I'm tired of running. I'll talk." The others looked at him in shock, but the young officer shook his head. "It's over. We can't hide this anymore." Jackson nodded, his gaze shifting to the other officers. The rest of you would be wise to follow his lead. One by one, the officers reluctantly agreed to come in for questioning, their bravado crumbling as they realized they were out of options. Caleb watched as they were escorted out of the office, a sense of victory and relief washing over him. But it wasn't over yet. They still needed to find Sarah, and that meant getting the truth out of these men. Hours later, Caleb and Jackson sat in the interrogation room, watching as the officers were questioned one by one. The young officer who had first agreed to talk was the most forthcoming, revealing details about the night Sarah disappeared and the orders they had been given to silence her. She was getting too close to the truth, the officer admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. We were told to make her disappear, to make it look like she went underground. But things went wrong. What happened? Caleb asked, his voice tight with emotion. The officer hesitated, then finally said, "We were supposed to take her to a safe house, but she fought back. She was strong, determined not to let us take her. In the struggle, she fell. She hit her head, and we panicked. We didn't know what to do." Caleb's heart ached as he listened to the officer's confession, but he forced himself to stay focused. "Where is she now?" The officer looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "We buried her, out in the woods near the old civil rights meeting place. We thought no one would find her there." Jackson exchanged a glance with Caleb, both of them understanding the gravity of what they had just heard. They finally had the truth, but it was a bitter pill to swallow. "Thank you for telling us," Jackson said, his voice measured. "But you'll still have to answer for what you did." The officer nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I know. I deserve whatever's coming to me." As the questioning continued, Caleb felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a sense of closure. They had found the truth, but it had come at a great cost. Sarah was gone, and there was no bringing her back. But at least now, her story could be told. The truth could be brought to light, and those responsible could be held accountable. A few days later, Caleb and Jackson stood in the clearing of the woods where Sarah's body had been buried. A team of investigators was carefully exhuming the site, ensuring that Sarah's remains would be treated with the respect and dignity she deserved. Caleb watched in silence, his heart heavy but resolute. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The truth had been uncovered, and justice was finally within reach. As the investigators worked, Jackson placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You did it, Caleb. You found the truth. Your mother and Sarah would be proud." Caleb nodded, his eyes focused on the scene before him. "We did it, Jackson. I couldn't have done this without you." Jackson gave him a small smile. "You're strong, Caleb. Stronger than you know. And you've got a bright future ahead of you." Caleb took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. "I'm going to make sure Sarah's story is told. I'm going to keep fighting for justice, just like she did." Jackson nodded, his expression filled with pride. "I know you will, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way." As they stood together, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the clearing. Caleb felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Back at home, Caleb found Hazel waiting for him on the porch. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with love and relief. "It's done," Caleb said, his voice soft. Hazel nodded, reaching out to take his hand. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb. You've done something incredible." Caleb sat beside her, feeling the warmth of her presence. "It's not over yet, Grandma. There's still so much to do. But I'm ready. I'm ready to keep fighting." Hazel smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "And I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." As they sat together in the fading light, Caleb felt a deep sense of connection to his family, both those who were with him and those who had passed on. The fight for justice was a long and difficult road, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. And with that knowledge, he felt ready to face whatever the future held, with hope, determination, and the strength of those who had come before him.